Hey everybody, Edo here, and today I was watching YouTube videos as I often do, and I was watching a video from Boogie2988 about whether or not it's okay for video games to be too hard or too difficult. For those of you who don't know Boogie2988, you might be familiar with him in his alter ego or character Francis, this raging gamer stereotype characterization, but over time, his content I have found to be really interesting and appealing. He's sort of become this elder statesman of YouTube content creators and video game content, and he's been going through some bypass or surgery and great videos on adpocalypse and all sorts of things. But anyway, I enjoy his content, and this video specifically was about difficulty in games, and specifically Cuphead, which is a game that has come out. If you're not familiar with it, it's sort of a platform shooter game that's loosely based on 1930s art style. So it's like super sort of old. I want to say Popeye, that might not be exactly accurate, but like this cartoony, neat aesthetic that is just ultra hard, right? And apparently it's hard. It's hard for a lot of people, and a lot of people have been frustrated with how hard that game has been. And in fact, I guess there was a video where a reviewer was doing the tutorial on live stream or something and couldn't complete it. And just articles about how that game's too difficult and that games shouldn't be that hard and game designers and game makers should make them easier, right? Like, sort of ridiculous in a way from a design perspective, but still interesting. And I was listening to what Boogie was talking about, and he started to talk a little bit about disabilities and gameplay and a variety of topics. And as I listened, I was sort of thinking about how that relates to board gaming. And in board gaming, we don't talk about difficulty too much. We certainly do talk about it, but generally speaking, a video game has a difficulty setting because it's sort of made for, most games you're playing, if it's not a fighting game where you've got like online ladders or, Warcraft or whatever, you're generally playing at the difficulty the developers or designers created for that game, and they're setting it. They could make it easier, they could make it harder, they could have different settings. You don't really have that too much in board games, though you definitely have different gamer types or different player types and audiences, and they like different things. And some players like more dense, complex games, some like lighter, longer, shorter, and a whole variety of things that you might lump into difficulty. And again, listening to his video, which isn't too long, it's 13 minutes, entertaining enough. I wanted to talk a little bit about it in video games, and to respond a little, and look, hey, whether it's Dark Souls, Ikaruga, Battletoads, right? There's always been hard games. I mean, I think a lot of mobile games, it's like, here's this impossible game about a cube on a line, dodge all the spikes, right? Like just hard games, and there's a certain satisfaction and sense of, prowess, agility, awesomeness, superpower for players who can master those games, right? And as a designer, I don't think there's anything wrong, just straight up, anything wrong with making a game difficult or hard, or however you want to make a game, right? As a designer, it really doesn't matter if you're thinking about the game design, the game mechanics, what you're making, whether or not you make it accessible to larger groups of gamers. And I'm not really talking about disability for a moment. I'm really just talking about difficulty with normal, people who don't have any challenges just, playing games in general, but this is just really high levels of difficulty. I think if that's what you want to do as a designer, that's fine. That has nothing to do with the size and market of your audience. That's when you're thinking about selling it and making it a product. If you're just making a game for yourself or for your friends, like, who cares, right? That's for you and your friends. The conversation comes when you're trying to make it for lots and lots of people. One of the reasons that I think Cuphead stands out compared to like a really hard game like Dark Souls, which is just hard for gamers, is that because of how novel and gorgeous and just attractive, but like appealing and powerful the art of that game was, I think it brought in a larger audience than you might have, an audience that really wants to see the progression and the characters and the art and the concepts, and don't mind, don't necessarily have the level of, hand agility to play that game. And so I think the tension comes from how appealing. If that game didn't look as novel and interesting as it did, no one would really care because they wouldn't be focused on it because it would just be this insanely difficult game. You play them on the internet all the time, right? And so I think that's where the tension came in. But then again, as a designer, that has nothing to do with you. Now, again, if you're a designer who wants to sell your game, it might. And thinking about how audiences can play and enjoy your game is super important, as is thinking about and understanding who your audience is. I remember I was designing Lion Pride, mobile, old game, paid game, 5 years ago, whatever it was. And in Lion Pride, I was level tuning everything. I was playing it and playing and playing, and I was responsible for spawning, spawn rate, enemies, progression, like everything. And I found myself playing some weekend, we were crunching or whatever, and I stood back and I was like, this game is awesome. Like, I'm in this, the zone of tension, edge of my seat pressure the entire way through. It's like tailored to me. Oh, I'm designing the game and I've balanced it perfectly for myself to make myself have fun, right? And that's not that's me, that's a game I enjoy, but probably not necessarily something that an entry-level player is going to enjoy, right? So stepping back from your work and making sure that you've balanced it and set it up for more than just hardcore developers to enjoy is a big part of it. I've sort of digressed into the conversation on the video game side, but I wanted to pull it into that product, there's the game design, but then there's the product and what audience and market you're selling it to. And that's really the conversation. You as a board game creator, designer, whatever, you should fundamentally understand who you want to have play your game. Do you want it to be core gamers? Do you want it to be people who like really hard stuff? Do you want it to be more casual? Do you want it to be accessible to more players, right? I think that those are the things you should be thinking about. Again, I recently wrote an article for Daniel Zayas on it's like Daniel Zayas blog or whatever his thing is, about theme in games and how you could have a game like Herbaceous, which is herbs, and have it really be for a very casual, all ages type of audience versus something that's more complex and dense. And a lot of that comes to just understanding who you're making your game for and what you want them to experience. So fundamentally, that's really important, and that's something that I carry over. So on the board game side, I want to tease through difficulty a little bit and tease through market and audience a little bit, because I think it's a conversation we should be having more in the board game space. It's like a fundamental must conversation in the video game space, but in the board game space, since players sort of level themselves out, it doesn't come up as much. Before jumping into that, I do want to talk about the disability thing. That's a critical conversation you should be having as a publisher or a game designer while you're making your product. You should be thinking about things like physical dexterity of moving pieces around and how that might impact a player. You should be thinking about color blindness and sight issues. Those are important things, and certainly, all categories matter. Color blindness is a large category because a lot of core board game players are older males, and older males oftentimes have some colorblind issues, and it's a very vocal audience in the game space. But beyond that, there's women who are colorblind. There are other ailments that people have that hinder their ability to play some games and deal with some things. Is it your responsibility to address those issues? I guess that depends on who you are as a person and how you think about things. But certainly, it's an audience that is craving content and an audience that can be served content, and oftentimes not too hard to support that audience while doing what you normally do. Sort of can talk about that in localization ways as well. But I want to set that aside because those are specific things you need to work towards. In the more general difficulty, when you're talking about board games, you can think about difficulty in a few different ways. One way is dexterity. there are a lot of dexterity games that are very much skill-based, and how difficult you make the maneuvers and actions and hand gestures and throws and tosses and flips dials into that sort of competitive expertise skill play. Knowing that you're going for that is going to really drive you to a certain audience. A really interesting game that did a really nice job was Ice Cool, right? Because that's the game with the penguins you flick. There's enough luck in it that it serves young audiences well and adults, but there's also the skill element, little like trick shots and pool, where you're able to bank and spin and glide, and it adds that layer of difficulty and depth with the lightweight accessibility. But dexterity is a category where you should be thinking about difficulty. How hard do you want to make it? I recently did a Kickstarter preview, I don't think it's posted yet, for a game called Mars Open, and it was a golf course game, and you're flicking things and trying to get bank shots and go over, and difficulty was a key part of that consideration and progression as far as dexterity. Then you just have, this is again different categories, then you sort of have puzzle, escape room, like really just creative thinking, puzzle problem solving difficulty. Having played a ton of escape room games, you see that, or time stories to an extent. What are the names of it? You got to escape the room, you got to exit the game, you got the other one I can't think of right now. But they're all, or escape, right? But they're all these games where they actually have difficulty ratings because of how hard they are, and that's a key consideration when you're developing a game with those sorts of logic puzzles. Do you want it to, like, how esoteric do you want it to be? How much help, how do you want to handle your hint system? Do you mind if people just walk away because they're just stumped because you're going for a certain audience? Again, know who you're making it for. So that sort of really, sort of logic, not quite math, but thinking through problem solving is like a key strength and a talent or ability. Along the same way, you also have games that just have knowledge requirements, right? Whether it's trivia games or vocabulary games like Scrabble and word games, how difficult those games are often comes to how much that person brings to the table in terms of like book learning. Again, and I guess one of the key things that's a takeaway as I ramble through this video is sometimes there are ways to have difficulty, but in video games you can just do the scaling and select your difficulty. But in board games, sometimes you need to do this difficulty thing by providing smart crutches or assistance to players. Again, in dexterity, it could be the ability for some luck to work along with a skill, but having enough skill play that skilled players feel good. When we talk about that sort of the escape room puzzles, to some degree, how you handle hints and how you handle your beginner puzzles can help ramp your players up. The one that I like, Sausage and Squee, is a really great version because of how nicely the sort of ramp is. Some of this escape room difficulty ones, they're like intense, man. They're really hard, unless you're like really good at that stuff. In trivia and word games, sometimes that can be alleviated by having a word game where it's not purely your vocabulary. Maybe there's some positioning and word order play in it. It could be something where, add bidding to a game and suddenly the players who are smarter, the other people are betting on whether they're right or wrong, right? Like suddenly, like wits and wagers, suddenly you're not only rewarding the smart people, but you're rewarding the watchers or the audience, or the spectators is the word I was looking for. Actually, and to digress for a second, some of those things, game spectation, I think that's how you'd say it, is like a thing now. It's a real thing, whether it's Twitch or YouTube or live streaming or whatever. Spectating games, my kids just watch other people play things because it's easier to consume it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about virality and audience, but that's key, right? Some people just want to consume content, not necessarily be taxed or challenged from it, and they also like the commentary. So complexity and sort of number crunching is also a way you could start seeing difficulty, especially if that kind of system um, rewards you being able to know the numbers, know the odds, know the advantages, and knowing it is just the amount of math you can sort of handle, like how big that brain is. That's a key place where you have difficulty, and that's a challenging one because if you don't do it right, it makes those types of people either super happy and powerful or super frustrated, especially if they're seeing through your little holes in your game and figuring, breaking it down. Stephen and I are working on herbaceous dice. I think I mentioned in a couple other videos, but if you hadn't heard it before, now you have. And we were faced with a situation, simple game, herbaceous audience, sunset over water audience. This is supposed to be really accessible, and in doing that, it has transparent scoring. So everyone's scoring in the middle of the table, and you can see where everyone's standing at any given time, and the standing is super, like, the math goes to 25 or 30. Right? This is like, if you're used to board games and you can do math quickly, you can be like, you got 15, you got 12, I've got 18, whatever. And one of the things I observed and noticed in playtesting was those gamer-type, strong, math-oriented players would sort of be doing that the whole time in a way that was sort of off-audience. A lot of our standard audience isn't really worried about that, but that gamer does worry about that, and then you get into an issue where that player either sort of knows a turn before the last turn that they've lost and then disconnects and has a bad closing to the game, closure, or they're like, already know they've won and ruined it for other people by sort of explaining how there's no hope in the game. And even if that's just the last round, it still is a consideration. And so Steve and I spoke about it, and we went back and forth, and part of it was like, is this a problem we need to solve? That's not the audience for this game, so maybe we just leave it alone. At the same time, all likelihood, those players will be playing with the core audience, and it does in some ways underline a little bit of that perfect information exposure on the table. And so talking about it, we talked about ways we might be able to introduce something fun and novel. There's an area on the board that has sort of unique scoring, and perhaps when you score that score is a token you keep face down. So you have lots of face-up information, but you have few pieces of face down, and if those tokens are cute and they look like flowers, maybe it actually feels like a nice reward for that casual audience. Like, oh, I get a token. But at the same time, slightly obscuring the total value at face value, and that was something we thought about. So I think sometimes when you face these different types of players, you can come up with different solutions. Learn knowledge. Another, in a way, in the category that I'm talking about it, is complexity on systems and multiple paths and multiple threads. Like some people are really good at long strategy and short game, and those games tend to be denser, tend to really be rewarding for those players, and perhaps that's that audience, right? Perhaps in those types of games, having a player who can think through all that and really enjoy it, Yokohama, or like all this stuff going on, that's probably what you're going for. If you want to dial that down, sometimes it's about your iconography, sometimes it's about visualization of score progression, and how you present information can oftentimes help other players engage and enjoy that as well. I think, lastly, there may be other categories. Those are the typical categories I think of difficulty in. The last one has to do with like access and cost and money, right? That's not really difficulty, but it's a barrier, right? It's something that is inhibiting players from being competitive. Perhaps Magic the Gathering is an example of that, or some of the miniature games, where the more you spend, oftentimes the more you have access to powerful experiences. This is a key consideration in mobile game development, and it's a key consideration when you're having a long-term live game with an elder audience and a younger audience, and how you keep the younger players, newer players, engaged when they're getting destroyed or trounced by the older elder players. And what's that balance like, and how do you address it, and how do you level the playing field? If you want to, it depends on what you're going for, but certainly money and cost can oftentimes be, in the context of this, difficulty when it comes to accessibility to your market and your audience. And I think that's really important. And maybe perhaps, Boogie, this is something that I would have added to your video, is that idea that really when people are talking about difficulty, they're talking about access, which you said, but again, there are all these other ways you can put barriers on access that frustrate players, and I think gets away from this, like, is it a gameplay thing, where more it's a product marketing audience thing, and who do you want to be playing your game and why? One of the other key things to consider, especially in board games, is when you think about your audience, and this was what I wanted to talk about a little bit, but it's more on marketing and virality, and I don't think it's as on. Virality and sharing, a lot of it comes from, first and foremost, how easy is something to consume. So a board game, 2 to 4, 8-hour board game is harder to consume than a filler game, which is harder to consume than perhaps a party game like Cards Against Humanity, which can be taught in 3 minutes and played. But it's easier to consume a video, and it's even easier to consume a picture and a tweet, right? So the virality and how you share things often comes down to how quickly things can be consumed by others, right? And so the easier something is consumed, the easier it is to spread. One of the reasons that you see, the Twitches and the sharing and the growth in indie or just independent content creators comes from how you're taking something that's hard to consume, whether because it's expensive or long or crazy difficult, and making it easy to consume. I'm not gonna go play through Cuphead. I'm not gonna invest that time, right? I break a million points in Geometry Wars, but I'm done putting that kind of time into that. But perhaps I'll watch a video because that art's so cool, and I want to see it, but I'm not gonna, it's just a level of investment. I'm not interested. I don't need that dexterity in my hands. Get too sore. So that's taking, it's a medium, it's changing the medium, but it's making the content more consumable. And then that includes with, again, with how long it takes to digest. So in consuming it, an image I see, a video might be a minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Playing a game's longer. The quicker you can enjoy the content, the better the virality of it is probably going to be. Again, Cards Against Humanity, if you're into that, or Apples to Apples, you can play and consume it really quickly, right? In there comes a little bit about whether something's contagious or not, and humor being contagious, and information being contagious, and those are different ways that virality spreads, but also that desire and want to share and push, and how you can push it. If I can tell you to go print a print and play, I can share with you faster than if I'm trying to get you to go buy something, or I only have a game that can be played with 2 people versus a game that can play with 6, whether it works well at cons. So those types of things matter when you're thinking about how your game spreads over time and in the industry in board games. Again, very different than video games. So I might have to do another couple videos at some point trying to break this out and being more articulate about the different parts. I really do think the Cuphead thing's pretty fascinating, and I think that Boogie did a good job of walking through at least his perspective on it. The bit about gameplay was an interesting sidebar, as is sort of, a media or reviewer being tasked with a game that they're not interested in. I generally stay away from heavyweight games because I don't play them as much. I like them a lot, but they're just not at the forefront. Recently normally I wouldn't be taking a dark, crazy monster slaughter. This is a game that's going to be out in October. I think the 31st they're launching on Kickstarter. But this is a game, it's got miniatures and I would normally just say no, but to reviewing it because I normally don't like that. But, I think his name was Greg or Jeffrey, the guy from Ankama, was like, hey, I think you'd like it and check it out. It's not as hard as it looks. And it's gorgeous. And I was like, fine, you guys make great stuff. Just send it and I'll work my way through it. And it turns out I really dug it, and I'll do it. My review is going to post with the Kickstarter. But my point is, But I stay away from things that I don't think I'm going to enjoy or play. And so as a reviewer, hopefully you can do that. Sometimes, you just get assigned stuff, and I feel bad if you have to, play games that you don't want to play. Anyway. Hope some segment and some portion of this was interesting to you. If not, thanks for watching regardless. Otherwise, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. Most importantly, play some great games. Thanks.